So I'm going to invite Michael up to say hello.
Hello.
So Michael, who are you, where are you from, and what do you do?
Oh, it's like blind date. You have a blind date? No, you're all too young. So I'm Michael. My name's Michael Otts, O-T-S, not Ox or Otis or Oats or Otters or any of the other variations that I've had. And my name actually comes not from England but from Estonia. That's my dad's side of the family are from Estonia. So I've been there, but I've never lived there. I grew up in Leicester. I studied in Scotland, and I live now in the south of England in Bournemouth, on the sunny south coast, where it's always lovely and hot and always summer. I wish. But yeah, it's a great place to live. And what do? I do things like this, actually. I eat cake. No. Well, I do get to eat a lot of cake and curry and all sorts of things. So it's not very good for my fitness, maybe. But I get to speak at universities all around the UK and all around Europe, in fact, partnering with groups like the Christian Union here, organising weeks like this Convinced Week here, engaging with some of these big questions about life, some of the big objections that people might have to the Christian faith. And so, yeah, I get to travel all over and do that.
Great. And can you tell us a fascinating fact about yourself?
Yes, I could. I'm just trying to think which one. Sorry, it wasn't that I was like, no, I have no fascinating facts. Okay, here's one fascinating fact. So when I was 2 years old, my family went with me to Gatwick Airport. I fell off a walkway about 30 feet onto concrete, landed on my head, fractured my skull, got rushed to a hospital that wasn't opened yet, met the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, appeared on national television and on the front page of the newspaper. Okay. And survived, I hasten to add. So that's a pretty good go. In fact, you might be thinking, like, did you sue the airport? Because it was actually the negligence of the airport that meant I walked off this walkway. And my uncle said they could only sue them if there was proof of long-term damage, which my mum has contested ever since. But yeah, there you go.
Great. So Michael's going to be speaking to us in a minute, and the title is Convinced I'm Happy as I Am. And can I just draw your attention to this phone number up the top? If you think of any questions during the talk, you can text them into this phone number, and we won't have time to do them all, obviously there's quite a lot of people here, but we'll do some of them and hopefully, get back to you on that. So,
brilliant.
Michael for the talk.
Fantastic, Miriam, thank you. Well, welcome. What a quality idea of the Christian Union to put on loads of cake and think about some of these big questions of life. And so we're going to be thinking about this subject, Convinced I'm Happy as I Am. And as Miriam said, please do text in if you have questions throughout the talk. To start with, I want to show a short video clip. This video clip is not in English, it's in German. Anyone speak German? Okay, a few of you. Okay, so you'll be able to understand it. And for those of you, for most of us, that don't speak German, all you really need to know is that the lady in this video clip is saying to her dad, "Dad, what do you think of the new iPad that I bought you for Christmas? Have you worked out how to use the new apps yet?" And you can see what happens, okay? Hopefully, if this works.
Sag mal, Papa, habe ich dich noch gar nicht gefragt. Wie kommst du denn eigentlich mit dem neuen iPad zurecht, was wir dir zum Geburtstag geschenkt haben?
Gut.
Mit den ganzen Apps kommst du klar?
Was denn für Apps? Geh mal bitte ein Stück zur Seite.
I love it. She looks like she's actually going to be sick at the end, doesn't she? Brilliant. So trust the Germans to be funny. They can be funny sometimes, can't they? Sorry, good German. But here's the point in that rather humorous video clip. How happy was that guy with his chopping board? Well, incredibly happy, wasn't he? He was there chopping away. Everything was great. He was completely happy with his chopping boards. The only problem was, it wasn't actually a chopping board. It was an iPad. iPads can work as a chopping board. They can work as lots of things, by the way. Once my friend decided to use my iPad as a speed ramp for my car. It worked quite well as a speed ramp. Didn't work very well as an iPad afterwards, I have to say. But iPads can be used for all sorts of things. But actually, all of us would say, well, he's missing something, isn't it? He's missing the fact that although he could be very happy using an iPad as a chopping board, an iPad was made for so much more than that. He's missing out on what it was really made for. And the question that we might want to ask is not, are we happy in life? Because many of us would say, yeah, I'm fairly content. Life's good. I've got into a good university. I may have some great friends. I may have what I want. But could it be, actually, that we're too easily satisfied? Could it be that actually there is a whole lot more to life that we've not even seen? And the problem is we don't even bother to explore whether there might be more to life because, well, everything's just okay. We're too easily satisfied. C.S. Lewis once put it this way in his writings. He said, if we were to consider, C.S. Lewis was a Christian theologian after being an atheist for much of his life. He says, if we were to consider the claims of the Christian faith, God would see that our desires are not too great, but too small. He says, we're half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. We're like a child who's content to make mud pies in the slum because we can't imagine what is meant by an offer of a holiday at the seaside. We're far too easily pleased. See, his problem, he says, about many of us is not that we're feeling great senses of existential lostness, that we're going from one area of depression to another, although that might happen for some, but for some of us, we're just too easily content. And we never stop to think, could there be even more? Could I have missed out? Maybe one of the reasons why we don't consider Christianity particularly when we think about the claims of whether there might be something more is that we automatically think that Christianity, if it does anything, would be out to ruin our fun. I'm happy, and following Jesus would make me the opposite. Now, certainly some Christians through history may well have given that impression, and some Christians today might do the same. But I think what I find fascinating about the person of Jesus is how radically different he is to our perceptions of what we think Christianity and God might be like. I don't know what you would expect a religious leader to do or how you'd expect a religious leader to act, but Jesus continually breaks our stereotypes. He hangs out at dinner parties. He turns water into wine. I think most religious people would expect Jesus to turn the wine back into water to stop them having so much fun. He hangs out with the wrong crowds. He offends the religious leaders. He goes into places of worship and turns over the tables and causes a commotion. He doesn't do what you'd expect. In fact, what kind of accusations do you expect to be levelled at Jesus? Well, probably not that he was a glutton and a drunkard, and yet that's the very accusation that people make of him. Now, he wasn't, but you've got to go to quite a few parties, drink and eat, haven't you, quite a bit, to be accused of doing that. And so Jesus isn't what we expect of religion or God. In fact, he continually offends the religious people and welcomes those that are completely irreligious. So much so that people start to wonder what he's all about. And so on one occasion, Jesus told a story to try and illustrate his points. And the story goes like this. I'll just tell it to you. Jesus said that there was a man that had 2 sons. And one day, the younger son said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance." So his father divided his property between them. And not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and he set off for a distant country where he squandered his wealth on wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that country and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to a citizen in that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs are eating. But nobody gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said to himself, "How many of my father's hired men have got food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I know. I'll get up, and I'll go back to my father, and I'll say, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up, and he went back to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to him, he threw his arms around him and kissed him. The younger son said, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said, 'Quick, Bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Let's kill the fattened calf and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost, and now he's found." So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older brother was out in the fields, and when he came near the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. And so he called one of the servants over and said, "What's going on?" "Your brother's come home," the servant replied. "And your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back, safe and sound." Well, at that, the older brother, he becomes angry, and he refuses to go in. So his father comes out and pleads with him. But he answers his father, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders, and yet you didn't even give me as much as a young goat so I could go and celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you go and kill the fattened calf for him?" "My son," the father says, "you are always with me and all I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and now he's found." That's the story that's often referred to as the story of the prodigal son. It's actually word for word as you'll find it in those books on your table in chapter 15. It's a story that Jesus told. Jesus told lots of stories, not to send people to sleep like we might do to kids, but to wake people up to reality and to the big issues of life. And he told stories that were actually thoroughly shocking to the people who would have first heard them. And this one is particularly so. You see, it all starts, doesn't it, with this guy who leaves home. Now we're thinking, that's not particularly shocking. Most of you have left home, I imagine, to come to university. And you were quite happy about that. And I guess some of your parents were also quite happy about that, okay? You were both looking forward to it. Because that's what we do. We get to a certain age, we go away from home, and we live life. And you're thinking, so what's so shocking about this guy who leaves home? Well, it was the nature of the way he left home. This guy doesn't just leave home because he's got to that age, but he says to his dad, "Dad, I want my share of the inheritance." Now, think about it. When do you normally get your parents' inheritance? Answer: when they're dead. So this guy is basically saying to his dad, "Dad, you know that stuff I'm going to get when you die? Can I have it now?" In other words, actually in that culture, what he was saying was, "Dad, I wish you were dead. And I want to live as if you were. I want your stuff, but I don't want you." And that would be incredibly offensive in any culture, then or now. And yet Jesus is saying, actually, that's actually how many of us could relate to God. We could say to God, "God, I want you to give me good stuff. I want you to give me a nice life. I'll get angry and bitter at you and blame you if you don't. But can you kind of keep out of my life? I want to do it my own way." Actually, the Bible says that's kind of what we all do. Now, why do we do that? Why did the guy in this story do it? Well, I imagine, although we're not told, the back of his mind, he's thinking this to himself. He's thinking, life at home is boring. Life away from home is exciting. And my dad is such a killjoy. If I could just get away from my dad, then I would be free. His rejection of his dad is driven by this desire for freedom, for fun, for happiness, and for everything else. And it's interesting, actually, what is it that drives, for many of us, our rejection of God? Maybe we live as functionally or practical atheists. We say God's not there. Is it because we have really researched it and looked into all the evidence and we've come to that firm conviction based on all of that reasoning that God doesn't exist? Or is it actually that we don't want God to exist? People often say that Christianity is wish fulfillment. We project our longings into the heavens for a God. But you could equally say the same about atheism, couldn't you? That we project our longings for God not to exist. It doesn't actually tell us whether he does or not. And it's interesting if you listen to some famous atheists through history, what they've said about this. Listen, for instance, to Aldous Huxley. He said, "I did not want the world to have any meaning, therefore I had no difficulty in arguing that it had none. The philosophy of meaninglessness was an instrument of liberation sexually and politically for me and my friends." Or a more modern day atheist, Thomas Nagel. He said, "I want atheism to be true. And I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God, and naturally hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want a universe like that. They're very honest, aren't they? That actually what's driving their atheism is actually a predisposition to not want this to be true. Because for many of us, our idea of God is a God that is, well, not one that you'd want to be hanging out with. So what happens? Well, this guy in the story, he leaves home, he goes and has an awful time. Well, actually, that's not true, is it? He goes and has a great time. I'm sure for a while, this guy is living it up. He's got stacks of cash. He's got loads of mates. Things are good. And it would be wrong, wouldn't it, for me to say that actually, unless you believe in God and live as a Christian, your life will be one long misery. Because it's not true. Some of you don't believe in God and you're quite happy at moments. What the story does say is this, that life outside of a relationship with God, while it may contain moments of happiness and joy, will always find that those things are transitory. And potentially that the expectation is far greater than the realisation. That when you get there, when you achieve what you really wanted, is it all that we really hope for? See, life can be like that, can't it? Last week was a kind of week of memorials, wasn't it? So the various people who had died and things like that. C.S. Lewis 50 years ago, Aldous Huxley 50 years ago, and personally for me, very exciting, 10 years since England won the Rugby World Cup. Okay, far more exciting. And it's good to kind of remember that, isn't it? Because at the moment we're pretty much doing rubbish at everything, whichever sport you look at, particularly rugby, and getting beaten by New Zealand. But 10 years ago we won the Rugby World Cup. Now, I am a huge rugby fan. I'm a Leicester Tigers fan, I have to tell you. Sorry if you support Bath. Wrong team. Just, come on. So Leicester Tigers are my club team, obviously England are my national team. And as a rugby fan from the age of zilch, I always kind of look forward to rugby games and particularly the Rugby World Cup. So I remember in 2003 when, well, it's quite a long time ago now, isn't it? It's 10 years ago. I remember sitting at my friend's house watching the World Cup final against Australia. And if you're a rugby fan, you'll know what happens. That close game where there's only 3 points in it, they're level going into the final minutes of the game, and then the ball comes out to Johnny Wilkinson, he kicks it, it goes through, and we've beaten Australia in Australia. Doesn't get better than that. Where's Naira? Sorry, we've got an Australian. I just had to do that for tonight. She's going to be upset about that. But hey, and I was just so excited. I was like, yes! Now, it's really funny because the World Cup final obviously was in the evening in Australia, but it was in the morning in England. So this is like 10 o'clock in the morning. Like, it was kind of weird, like this amount of excitement, just like straight out of bed. And so like, this is 10 o'clock, we've won the World Cup. And then it's like lunchtime, and I'm walking through town. And I think to myself, what am I going to do now? We've just won the Rugby World Cup. This is the best moment of my sporting life. My sporting life is watching sport, by the way, rather than playing it. It's the best moment of my sporting life. And what now? I read an interview a few weeks later with Johnny Wilkinson. And he said, basically, he felt the same. Well, not the same as me, because he doesn't know me. But that sense of, I've done it, but now what? And that kind of almost great sense of emptiness when you achieve your greatest goals and find that, what next? There can be an emptiness that can return, can't there? 2 quotes from very different people. This guy, Freddie Mercury, said, I had it all and then something. But does anyone know what we're living for? You can have everything in the world and still be the loneliest person. Success has brought world idolisation and millions of pounds, but it's prevented me from having the one thing we all need, a loving, ongoing relationship. Or, he said they were quite different, Prince Charles. I just thought I could show that it would be quite, can you get 2 more opposite people? There remains, he says, I won't do his accents, there remains, he says, deep in the soul, the persistent and unconscious anxiety that something is missing, something that makes life worth living. That sense of, is there anything more? Is this it? Well, let's go back to the story. Think of this guy. He's got to that point and he ends up with nothing, and he ends up in a pigsty. Now, I'm not sure what your career path is. I'm imagining pig farming is not what you were having in mind when you came to Bath. Given the current economy, might be the only option after you leave, but we'll see. But particularly for a Jewish boy in the 1st century, pig farming was definitely not high up his career choices. I mean, this is really the pits, isn't it? I mean, the illustration is like he's really reached a new low. And yet, in some ways, that pigsty was a really good place. Because it seems that it's the first time in this man's life where he actually stopped to think. See, it's true, isn't it, that we can live our lives so often on fast forwards, rushing from one thing to the next, without ever taking time just to stop and ask big questions. Not just kind of asking clever philosophical questions, but really deep personal questions about life. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Click. It's quite funny. This guy who has a remote control to control his life, and he's always pressing fast forward through all the boring bits to get to the exciting bits. But then, before he knows it, he's fast forwarded through his whole life. I wonder if we could take a remote control in our lives, do we ever take the time to press pause and stop and just ask those big questions? And actually, this week might be a really good time to do that. To come along to events like this and just say, is there more? What is it all about? Could I be too easily pleased? Am I missing something here? Well, this guy takes time to think. And as he takes time to think, he thinks about the bum deal he's got. You see, here he is in a pigsty, and he thinks about the fact that he's, well, not got what he really wanted. And so he has a think to himself, and he decides he's going to go home. Now, you might think, wow, this is great. This guy's had a real change of heart. Now he's like, he loves his dad again, and he's sorry for what he's done, and everything's going to be great. Now, maybe that is actually a bit too much, because actually, if you're not a bloke here, okay, if you're a woman, there's two things you need to know about how blokes' brains work, okay? Blokes think about two things quite a lot, okay? One is sex, and the other is their stomach, okay? They kind of oscillate between the two, okay? So you can get blokes to do almost anything for either, particularly food. I mean, like, it's just good to know this. And this guy is hungry, isn't he? He's sitting in a pigsty, he's got nothing to eat, and he thinks, where is there food? There is food at home. But he's got a problem. He can't just rock up home and say to his dad, Dad, I'm back. Because in that culture, he's just offended his whole family's name. He spent his family's fortune. He can't just rock up and say, I'm home. So he needs to have a plan. So he comes up with a very clever plan. He thinks, I'll think of a good speech, okay? If in trouble, think of a good speech. And he says, I'll say to my dad, Dad, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your servants, your hired man. He thinks that'll do the trick. I'll earn my way back home. And so he sets off. I don't know how far the journey was, but you can imagine as he's journeying home, kind of him thinking to himself, can't you? As he goes home, he's thinking, oh man, what's going to happen? How's my dad going to respond? What's he going to say? And I imagine he would kind of repeat in his head over and over again this little speech. Dad, I've sinned against heaven, against you. Dad, I've sinned against heaven, against you, etc. And so he heads home. And as he gets over the brow of the hill and he looks down into the town where his dad lives, he sees the little speck of a man running down the high streets and running out of the gate of the town and running towards him. And as he looks closer, he realises it's his dad. Now again, this is quite a shocking thing in that culture. Grown men in first century Palestine never ran. Good idea, I say. Everyone who runs, it's bad for your health. Do you know? Bad for your health running, because everyone who runs dies. Yeah? Proven. So, they got it right. Grown men didn't run. But this grown man is like, he's doing the 100-metre sprint down the high street. So he's kind of hitched up his little kind of 90, and he's like legging it down to see his son. Now, again, just pause, okay? Just think you're there. You're listening to Jesus tell the story. You've never read the Bible. You don't yet know this is Luke chapter 15. You don't know how the story's going to end. What's going to happen? Is he going to come and hold out his arms and belt his son one? Tell him to go home? That's what he deserves. And actually, in that culture, that's what everyone would expect. And yet it's not what happens, is it? He throws his arms open, not to hit his son, but to welcome his son. And to receive him home, not as a slave, but as a son. But the younger son starts his speech. He says, Father, I've sinned against heaven, against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But he never gets to the end. He never says the last little bit about make me one of your servants. Why? 2 reasons. Firstly, he doesn't have to. Because he's just been welcomed as a son, not a slave. But secondly, because something's happened in this guy's heart in that moment when he sees his father's love. You see, when this guy is set off from the pigsty, all he's thinking about is food and thinking about how his dad can give him some. But when he gets home and sees his father's love and sees the depths of his compassion, he's not really thinking about food anymore. Now he's just thinking about his father. You see, his heart has changed. And this is the point. It's when you start to see the depths of God's love shown for us in Jesus, and only really when you see that, that it'll ever change your hearts. If you think of God as some dictator in the sky just waiting for you to step out of line so he can punish you, look at the God who left heaven to come into this world and take the shame and the guilt of each one of us, carrying the can in our place so that we can be welcomed home against all the odds for the way we've treated him, not giving us what we deserve, but taking what we deserve so that we can have what we don't deserve. It's incredible grace. And if you start to see that God might be like that, then it may just start to change your heart. So rather than hating this kind of God, or just using this kind of God to get what you want, you might actually want to know him for yourself. Well, you might think that's the end of the story. It's not quite, is it? It's not quite the end of the story, because there are two characters in this story that are really unhappy at the return of the younger son. One of them is the older brother, and the other is the fattened calf, okay? The fattened calf for obvious reasons. He gets mentioned like 3 times. He's one of the main characters. Not that I want to play him. The older son is not happy, is he? Like, he sees the party, he hears the music, he hears everything else, and he's not going in. And at first, when you hear the story, you think this guy's got a point, hasn't he? I mean, there's the younger brother going away, spending his father's money, shaming his father's name. He's worked hard. He's done everything. And his dad hasn't given him anything. Or has he? See, what's really interesting in that story is that at the beginning of the story, the father says that he divides his property between them. In that culture, it meant 1/3 would go to the younger son and 2/3 to the older. So he already had it. So at the end of the story, the father's able to say to the son, all I have is yours. He meant it. It was already his. And yet, for some reason, this older son thought he had to earn it. He thought he was a slave, not a son, and he thought he had to do something to get it. And I think Jesus includes this character for a really important reason. If we just heard the first part of the story, we would think the answer to being like the younger son is to become religious and to start to pull your socks up and behave and to try and do good things in the hope that God might accept you back one day, to become a slave. And yet Jesus says, no, that's not the way to do it, because that's the mistake the second guy made. It's not to be a slave and to earn God's acceptance, but it's to be his son and to enjoy his welcome and to be invited in to the party. And that party is one that he wants to invite us to as well. Whoever we are, whether we identify with the younger son or the older son, whether we're very, very religious or absolutely opposites, God says, however you've treated me, I want to invite you to enjoy that party too. I'm going to invite Naira to come up, who is from Australia. Gutted. Actually, I can't really speak, can we, after the cricket? And she's going to tell us about the difference that this made in her life.
Thanks. I hope you can understand me. We do speak English in Australia with a slightly dodgy accent. I just wanted to share with you who I am in the character, I guess. And sometimes I'd like to think I was the older son, but really I'm the prodigal son. So I grew up in Australia, and it's a Christian country. You sent all the convicts out there 200 years ago, and you sent some chaplains as well. So we're a Christian country. And so I grew up knowing about God, but I decided to be just like the prodigal son. Even though I knew God, I didn't like the rules that I think he set for my life. And so I decided that I didn't want to live under the rules that God set for me, mainly because I thought I could never live up to them. I was always sort of making mistakes and failing, and it's hard growing up. It's hard being a kid. It's hard being an adolescent. And so for me, the crunch time came when I was 16. I got run over by a car crossing the road outside school, and I thought, gosh, I've been like trying really hard, God, to do what you want me to do in my life, but you weren't really looking after me. Like, why would you allow a 16-year-old girl to get run over leaving school? Like, I looked right, I looked left, I looked right, got hit. Like that just doesn't make any sense to me. And so I decided that I would take full control of my life again, and I would make all the decisions. And I made a definite decision to reject God in my life. Life went on. I went to university like you guys now are, and I lived the university lifestyle. I lived in college resis. I partied. I did well at uni. I failed a few subjects, but then I did them again and passed. And like life was pretty good. I had some great friends. I had some great times. I had some really hard times. And my success in my life was always based on how well I did. I could always congratulate myself when I did well. And when I didn't do so well, that was, I guess I took responsibility for that as well. And I just sort of did life. In my last year of university, something happened that I couldn't control. I got a phone call. I was living in London at the time. I was working at a hospital doing my last placement. And I got a call from back in Australia, from home, saying that my father had been diagnosed with cancer. Now I'm like 20,000 miles away from home. I can't control this. And so all I knew was that God could control it. And so I made a deal with God. I said, God, if you can heal my dad, then I'll think about letting you back into my life. Now that sounds really arrogant as I say it right now, but that was who I was. So a couple of years passed. My dad had 2 years of chemotherapy treatment and a bone marrow transplant. And 2 years later, he was given the diagnosis that he was in remission. That forced my hand. I had to hold up my side of the bargain. God had held up his side of the bargain. And so I was this reluctant, prodigal son returning back to the Father's house. My motivations were not pure. My motivations were to hold up my side of a bargain. What I found was the same as the prodigal son in the story. I found that I had God running towards me. And all the rules and all the hurdles that I thought God had put up in my life, I realised were rules and hurdles that I'd made for myself. See, I had rejected a God who didn't exist. I had rejected a God who was in my mind, but not a God of reality. And when I returned to my Father's house, I returned to God, I discovered that He is so loving. That when I am unfaithful, He is faithful. When I fall over, when I mess up, when I stuff up, He is there with me, beside me the whole time, forgiving me, pulling me up, and giving me the strength, the courage to keep on going. And so I now live as a Christian. My life has been transformed and changed. I now live a life that is full of happiness, that is because I know who my Father is. I know His plans for my life, and I know who He wants me to be. And so in the good times, I'm full of joy in the Lord. In the really tough times, and I can tell you there's been some of them. A Christian doesn't mean that life is always easy. I know I have a God who's with me 100% of the time, giving me everything I need to keep on going each and every day. So any of you guys out there who haven't discovered this real God, then I urge you to speak to a friend, speak to one of us, and to discover this God who really does love you with everything He has and is desperate to be in relationship with you because He loves you that much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Lara. Awesome. What we're going to do now is we're going to take literally 1 minute break. So if you've not had an opportunity yet to text in, then you can do that if you want to add a question. And during that time, Gareth is going to try and make his way with the phone to the front of the room somehow. That's your challenge if you choose to accept it, Gareth. And so do text in. Maybe if you're not sure how to word that question, chat with it. Chat about it to the person next to you. And then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions before we wrap up. And then there'll be an opportunity for more dessert, okay? So just take that time to whack that question in now. Should we make a start?
Okay, if you could all take a seat again, we've got some questions. If everyone could take a seat again, that would be great, because we've got some questions that people have texted in.
Go on, raise your voice.
Okay. Alright, if everyone could take a seat, that would be great. Anyone who's still getting food, just grab a seat. So the first question that we've got is, how can believing in God make you happy when there are so many rules to follow?
Yeah, good question. I guess you might be hearing all that saying, okay, nice story, but what about the rest of the Bible? What about the Ten Commandments? What about all those rules that surely Christians have to keep on following? Is that just like the small print at the bottom of the deal? That's like, it looks good, but actually, if you really look into it, here are all the restrictions. Firstly, it's worth saying, if you read the Bible, as a whole, the Bible's made up of lots of different books, and broadly speaking, it's split into two halves: the Old Testament before Jesus, the New Testament after Jesus. The Old Testament, primarily written about the story of the nation of Israel, and written to that nation and the events that took place in them, came before Christ. And in that, there's lots of law. In fact, people often called it the law. Some Jews worked out there were 613 laws that you had to keep if you were going to obey God properly, which is quite a lot to remember, not just 10. I mean, I struggle trying to remember 10 things being a bloke. But 613. And then they had groups called the Pharisees, who ended up making up even more laws, just so they were like a demarcation zone around the law, just so you didn't even get close to breaking the law. Okay? So they were kind of obsessed with laws. And so you're like, what? Do we just discard the Old Testaments? Well, it's interesting because Jesus says that he's not come to abolish the Old Testament, the law, but he came to fulfill it. So he lived the life we should have lived. He completely obeyed on our behalf. And he kept and fulfilled that law in our place. So he says we don't have to. Our challenge if we're a Christian is not to go back and look at the 613 laws of the Old Testament, but actually to follow Christ. So a later Christian in the New Testament called Paul said, I'm not under the law, but he says, I follow Christ. And so that means not so much that we're given a set of rules to live by, but we're actually invited into a relationship with a person. Now, if you're invited into a relationship, if you get into a relationship, do relationships come with rule books? Not normally, okay? If I was to get married, which I'm not, but if I was to get married, imagine if on our wedding day, it's like, now here are the rules, and I say, what I'd like on certain days of the week for food and things like that, and here's the rule book. Well, that's not how it works. Does it mean that actually relationships, therefore, and marriages never change people's lives and people just carry on living the way they should, or the way they did? Well, hopefully not, okay? Hopefully maybe even pre-marriage you could imagine how that relationship would change the way you live. But not in the sense that you've now been given a list of rules, but because you've come into a relationship. And in that relationship, you live differently. You want to live in a way that pleases them, and because you love them. And so I'd say the same is true as a Christian. I want to live in a way that pleases Jesus because I love him. Also because I'm convinced he's good and he's for me. And so I'm convinced that actually, if he says something's good, it's because it really is good, not just because he's making some arbitrary rule to spoil my fun. So I can say actually quite honestly as a Christian, I have no regrets from following Jesus. There is great joy in it. It's not always easy, of course not. But the easy choice is not always the best choice, nor the choice that we look back on with the most amount of gratitude. Actually, there is lasting and real joy and pleasure in living God's way, because he's good. And if you're not convinced he's good, well, it's kind of going back to the issue of, well, look at what he's done for you. If he's willing to do that for you, I think I can see that he's for me. He's on my side. So it's not about following rules. It's about knowing a person. And that will change your life. But I think for the better, not the worse. Okay?
Great, thank you. Our next question is, does not going to church make an individual a bad Christian?
Does not going to church make you a bad Christian? It's like church is a kind of register. It's like, got to make sure you're there 3/4 of the time, otherwise you're a bad Christian. it's kind of interesting when we use the kind of phrase bad Christian or good Christian. I think it betrays something about what we think a Christian is. Often I meet people and they say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but a bad one. And it betrays that actually what we often think a Christian is a Christian is someone who tries hard to follow rules, and therefore a good Christian is the person who follows the rules well, and a bad Christian is someone who doesn't. He kind of breaks the rules. But if actually being a Christian is not about following rules, but it being in a relationship, that kind of changes the way we think about it, doesn't it? If you're in a relationship, it's not about keeping rules, about achieving moral perfection or even a level of moral goodness that's better than others, but it's about knowing God's forgiveness, knowing His love and relationship. Now, if I'm in a relationship with God, if I really know that, I want to grow that relationship. The Bible says there's different ways you can do it. You grow it by reading God's word as He speaks to you through the Bible. You can speak to Him in prayer, and also through meeting up with other Christians. And I love meeting with other Christians, not because I have to. I haven't been to church for 3 weeks, but that's because I've been travelling. So I've been to other churches. But I go to church because I want to. And maybe if you see going to church as a kind of obligation that you would have to do, you've probably been to the wrong church. And maybe you need to check out some others. Because certainly church is a highlight of my week, not a low light. I've got a friend who's a multi-million-pound businessman. He's sold aeroplanes all over Europe for Pilatus. And he's my mate, which is great. And once he was flying me somewhere, which is kind of what you get when you have a mate that's got a plane business. And so I went in, and he was telling me about a conversation he'd had with one of his colleagues. And his colleagues were talking, and they said, "Oh, you're a Christian. Why are you going off to church? That's a miserable waste of time." And he says, "Listen, I've got millions of pounds, a successful business, a nice house overlooking the sea, but the best moments of my week, each week, is when I get to go to church." And he means it. He says, "Look, this is what my life's about. These other things, you can take them away. But I know real joy in that." Okay?
Great. So our next question is, what if I never feel unhappy that I don't know God?
Yeah, good question, because maybe, I guess there's probably quite a few of you here. And if you're honest, you're saying that I don't feel existentially lost or unhappy. I feel completely content. I guess there are two things maybe worth thinking through. In that story that Jesus told, it's interesting that in that story, the son, the younger son who leaves home, doesn't kind of immediately leave home and go, "Oh no, my life's a mess." Just start crying. Like, yeah, I'm sure for a while, I don't know how long, he has a great time. Okay? And the point Jesus is making is not that if you don't believe in God, if you don't have a relationship with God, instantaneously everything in your life is awful and you'll feel terrible. But I think it is true that actually living without God ultimately leaves an emptiness in life. Not necessarily now, because at this point in most of your lives, you're thinking, well, my hopes and my dreams are ahead of me. But I've got a little bit longer to live, and I've also met people that have lived a lot longer than me. And actually, it's very interesting that later on in life, you start to ask some pretty big questions. Some friends of mine that I hang out with a lot just had their first baby. And no thought really of God before that, but they're just saying, wow, suddenly makes you ask questions about life and what it's all about, and what are the values and hopes, and what's the purpose of this child that we just brought into the world. So even though you may not be thinking about that now, I reckon there will be times in life when you will ask those questions. But even if you didn't, even if you went through life completely happy, I would say actually checking out the claims of Jesus is still really important. Jesus told another story about a rich fool. He said a guy who had everything he wanted, successful business and everything else, and he says to himself one day, everything's great. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to increase my business next year and have even more money. And then Jesus in the story says, what a fool, because that guy died. A fool because all his success and money didn't mean anything, but also because if Jesus' claims are true, he's saying they have implications not just existentially for the way we live life now, but ultimately beyond death. And to ignore them would be really serious. And so whether or not you feel in your heart that sense of lostness, Jesus' claims are such that if they're true, they're of massive eternal importance, and if they're false, they're of no importance. But they're not just moderately important. So check them out. Because if they are true, they have a big implication on your life. Maybe to give you an illustration before we get to the last question. Or so. Is that the last question? Second to last. Imagine you were sitting on the beach in Thailand back in, I'm trying to remember the year, 2004. And it's Boxing Day, day after Christmas. And you're sitting there saying, I'm just happy. I'm perfectly happy. You probably were. You probably were. But actually the reality is that in a few minutes later, that morning, that Boxing Day morning of that day, there was a huge tsunami that swept a lot of very happy people into eternity. I say that to say that actually the way you feel doesn't actually always relate to your situation. You may be in great danger and not know it. Jesus says actually there is a real serious danger of ignoring me and living your life without reference to me. And if these things are true, then it'd be worth checking that out. But there's also great joy in knowing him as well. Great. Cool.
So the next question is, how can you have a relationship with God if you can't see him or hear him?
Yeah. Is it like, as a friend of mine once said, is it like, it's that invisible friend, your imaginary friend? And he said to me, look, I grew out of my imaginary friend when I was 6. It's about time you did as well. Well, for a start, if believing in God is just having an imaginary friend, there are lots of very, very intelligent people that have this imaginary friend as well. So how can you have a relationship with God if you don't see him or know him? Firstly, just because you can't see God doesn't mean you can't be convinced that these things are true. The Bible doesn't compare faith and reason, it compares faith and sight. And you can have very good reasons for believing things that you can't see. And on Friday we're going to look at the evidence for the resurrection of Christ to say actually even though we can't personally, physically see Jesus now, there are some very good reasons for thinking that the foundation of the Christian faith is based on objective truth, and you can check it out. So firstly, just because I can't see doesn't mean I can't know. And the Bible says that the Jesus that I can't see, but the Jesus who really lived, died and rose again, who is real today, is available to have a relationship with. And so how do I have that relationship? Well, as I said earlier, how do you grow a relationship through communication? So what I discovered about the Bible is that it's not simply historically true, but having built on that, I've discovered it's more than that. Actually, God can speak to me through it. It's his words. And that God wants me to speak to him in prayer and get to know him. And so it's not an invisible imaginary friend. It's based on real truth. It's a relationship with Christ, who I can get to know through God's word, the Bible, and a relationship that can grow. And if you're thinking, what does that even look like? I mean, that just sounds alien. Why not ask one of the Christians around your table in a few minutes' time what it looks like for them? Because there are lots of Christians in this room that say this relationship has changed their life, and it changes their life on a daily basis. And so ask them what difference it's made to them. Okay?
Great. And the final question we've got is, what if I'm a Christian and I'm unhappy?
Yeah, good question. And a nice question, isn't it? There might be many reasons why you could be a Christian and unhappy. You may be going through really difficult times. The circumstances of your life could be really tough. Maybe that you're struggling, as a Christian friend of mine, it's one of my closest friends, with serious medical depression, and he has done now for nearly a year. Jesus doesn't say that if you follow him, you'll know a kind of surface happiness throughout your life, kind of the Cheshire Cat smile. In fact, Christians who are like that are often quite annoying, aren't they? And everything's just like, yay! And I'm like, oh. Because that's kind of often, and it's often fake. It's kind of the Ned Flanders kind of Christianity. It's just like, oh, give us a break. So it's not kind of a surface happiness, but Jesus does talk more about joy when he talks about happiness. Actually, there is a joy, and a joy and happiness can be different things. Joy can be a much deeper thing. Some Christians reckon it's so deep that it never comes out, and that's also a problem. It's like, I am so joyful. But actually it is true, isn't it, that in life you can be unhappy about your present circumstances and yet still know joy. I mean, to try and give you a stupid illustration, at the moment it's cold, okay, and I'm quite tired because I've been on the road for a long time. And when I woke up this morning, I was like, oh, it's early and it's still dark. And I wasn't feeling particularly happy, but then I thought to myself, well, you're hoping that I was going to say something like, but then I thought of you lots, and I was going to speak tonight, and I was really happy. But actually, I have to confess, it wasn't that. I thought that in 2 weeks' time, I'm going on holiday to New Zealand, okay? And I thought about that, and I thought, wow, I'm going to New Zealand in 2 weeks. And suddenly, I was joyful. But it was still dark, and it was still cold, and I still had to get out of bed. My present circumstances hadn't changed, and yet my joy was there because I knew what was happening. And Jesus says that actually, even though our present circumstances may be challenging, if we trust him, we can have real joy because we have real hope. That actually life now is not all there is. Our circumstances now are not all we've got. And that we can have ultimate hope in the future. That's not to say there aren't real blessings to being a Christian now. There are. And I wouldn't change it for the world. And there's been great joy in following Christ. But for some it can be very tough. And in my life it's also, at times, been difficult. Like when my best friend killed himself. And in those kind of situations, I'm not feeling lots of great happiness. But the knowledge that one day God's going to sort out this screwed up, messed up world and give me a hope of a world that's made perfect, a solid, certain hope based on the resurrection, gives me real joy, even though my circumstances may be really tough. And so joy is a deeper thing that can be there even when the happiness of our surrounding circumstances may not be. Great questions. Thank you so much. Guys, if you've got more questions, please do stay and chat. There's going to be more cake in a minute. So you can eat more calories and ask more questions. Just before we finish, I just want to ask you really, kind of rhetorically, you don't have to answer verbally. I just wonder, kind of, as you listen to this, I wonder how you respond to it. I guess there are some of you, and you might be sitting here saying, that all sounds nice in theory, but actually I do think this whole thing is a load of rubbish. I'm still not convinced at all, and I have no reason to think this should be true. Well, thank you firstly for coming, and thank you for staying. Maybe you felt, well, I had to, because I couldn't really get out because it's so packed. Well, thank you for staying anyway. But if that is you, okay, if you are thinking that, our encouragement to you this week would be to say, listen, hopefully you could see the implications of this would be big if they were true. Make sure you've taken time to really investigate it for yourself. Don't just take, your RE lessons as a kid and what the media says about Christianity as your foundation stone for what it really is all about. Two things you could do: take away these books, these uncover books, and have a read for yourself of the person of Jesus and say, what do I make of it? Have the kind of credibility to say, well, before I reject this completely outright, I could take a couple of hours of my life and see what this is all about. And you could also have a look at this book, which is called Jesus for Skeptics. It's written by a friend of mine. I say he's a friend, he's also 83 years old. So he's not like, best buddy throughout my life. But he's spent most of his life as a historian, a biblical scholar, and a Christian. And he's written this book for people who are skeptics, maybe like you, skeptical about whether this is even true. And it starts with the questions of, did Jesus even exist? Going on to some of the more fundamental and foundational questions about, can we trust the New Testament? Did the resurrection happen? And you can have this or any of the books on the bookstall for £1, okay? That's not because they're rubbish, it's because we subsidise them down, okay? If you're a member of the CU, it costs slightly more, okay? Please don't leave the Christian Union just to get the free books or the cheap books. That would be unhelpful. But have a look at the books and take one away. Maybe you're saying, actually, I don't think this is rubbish, but I'm not convinced. I'm maybe at the level of intrigued. And if you're in that situation, then hopefully you could see that looking into this more would be a good idea. And so as well as the events that are going on every day, and we welcome you to come to every single one of them, after this week, there's going to be a course called Uncover that's going to be going on in lots of different locations around the university, down in town and up the hill, where you can investigate and uncover these claims and ask all those questions and really look at the source document about Jesus for yourself and think it through. And if you'd like to come to that, I'll tell you in a second how you can sign up. And then maybe there are some people who are actually saying, I think this might be true. And I actually would love it to be true, because if it is, this does sound good news. Maybe this is different to your preconceptions. Maybe actually you're at a point of saying, how would I get started? Well, maybe for some of you, actually, it's the point of actually saying, you've heard enough to be able to say, I'd like to get started. And you could talk to God. Say to God, look, I'm sorry for the way that I've rejected you. Thank you for what you've done for me. Please accept me, forgive me, and come into my life. And he will. That's all it takes to start that relationship, to be invited in. But it's a wonderful relationship. I often think that story is kind of ironic, because the guy in the story leaves home looking for a party, but the greatest party is in the home that he left. So often we reject God, looking for joy, looking for life, and yet the testimony of lots of us here is that we've found the greatest joy, the greatest life in knowing God through Jesus. And if you'd like to do that, there's a couple of things. Again, we'll tell you about the feedback form in a second, but I've also got some little booklets called Yes. And they're for people who are considering or who have or would want to make that step of saying yes to this offer that Jesus makes to you. And they're absolutely free. You don't even have to pay 20p for these. They're free. And I'm going to be milling around somehow amongst this massive crowd. And I'll have a pile of these booklets, and you can gladly come and take one off me. You don't have to chat at length if you don't want to. You can just take one. It'll take you about 15 minutes to read, but you'll find it really helpful as it unpacks kind of more of what it would do or what it would mean to respond to that offer. And then what you've also got is a feedback form. And because you've heard enough of me, I'm going to hand back to Miriam, and she's going to explain how you can respond and fill this out and give us a chance to do that. So thank you.
Great. So you should see the feedback form in the middle of your table. If someone could just grab them on each table and hand them round with the pencils, that would be really great. We really appreciate your comments and your feedback on this talk and on the whole week. So if you could just all fill that out now, and if you tick the box that says "Tell me more," that's for anyone who's interested, and someone will get back to you with some more information. And if you're thinking you really agree with everything Michael's saying and that you would like to be a Christian, come and see him afterwards, and also tick the Count Me In box, and someone will get back to you as well. So if you could just do that now, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you.